So I wanted to begin by talking a little bit about the stage theory of cognitive development. So this is an important theory in psychology that was proposed by Jean Piaget, who is a Swiss psychologist. And overall, this theory states that children pass through a series of cognitive stages as they grow, and there's four cognitive stages, and these four begin with the sensory-motor stage, the pre-operational stage, the concrete operational stage, and the formal operational stage. So each child must pass each stage successfully before they can move on to a next one, or they may face difficulties. And two basic components of Piaget's theory include schemas, which are building blocks of knowledge, and also assimilation and accommodation, which is what helps people create and kind of add to existing schemas. And something that I read in the text that I'm going to read, it says that the stage of theory of cognitive development is an extremely useful theory in human development because it can be applied to many different content areas and can be tested in many different ways. So for this assignment, I'm going to discuss the sensory-motor stage, and just to give a little bit of background information about the stage itself, it begins from birth to 2 years, and it is when a child experiences the world through the fundamental senses of seeing, hearing, touching, and tasting. And so this being said, babies form their first schemas through using these primary senses, and ultimately babies use their senses to perceive the world. So that this is kind of like an important stage in terms of that, because it's when babies do first apply these primary senses, and it is also a period of rapid cognitive growth. So for the first component that I'm actually going to be discussing for the sensory-motor stage, it's the main concept introduced in this stage, and it's referred to as object permanence. And just to quickly define object permanence, it's the child's ability to know that an object exists, even when the object cannot be perceived. So just to give an example of this, if I were to grab a toy and hide it behind my back, then a child who has perceived object permanence would be able to identify that the toy was behind my back. However, at the beginning of the stage, a child does not automatically achieve object permanence, and they may just behave as if the toy disappeared completely. So, for example, my friend's brother, he's about 6 months, and I attempt to see if he's attained object permanence sometimes. So I would grab his toy and I hide it behind my back. However, he just acts as if the toy disappeared. He hasn't achieved object permanence yet, because I read somewhere that a baby usually achieves this when they're around 8 months, and he's 6 months, so it makes sense as to why he might not have achieved it yet. And when a child accomplishes object permanence, it symbolizes their preparedness to move on to the pre-operational stage, which is the second stage of the stage theory of cognitive development. So along with object permanence being the kind of main component of the sensory-motor stage, there are also 6 substages, and these are simple reflexes, primary circular reactions, secondary circular reactions, coordination of reactions, tertiary circular reactions, and early symbolic thought. So I'm going to kind of be talking about 1 or 2 more of the substages, but the first one I'm going to be talking about is simple reflexes. So within the first month of life, babies are typically born with certain reflexes. And to define a reflex, it's an involuntary and nearly instantaneous movement in response to a stimulus. So the first example of a reflex that I'm going to kind of talk about is referred to as the rooting reflex, and it's when a baby's cheek is stroked and they kind of turn their head and have their mouth open to turn toward the stroking, and are kind of ready to just suck. So they suck in a reaction for feeding, so they automatically assume that when they turn their head that they're going to get fed. And another reflex is referred to as the blinking reflex, and it's when a light is flashed in a baby's eyes and the baby will close both eyes. So that's an example of the blink reflex, and each reflex does have significance to it. So for example, the first one It signifies and ensures that the infant's feeding will be a habit. And for the blinking reflex, it's significant because it protects eyes from harmful and potentially dangerous stimuli. So finally, the third substage I'm going to be talking about is our primary circular reactions, and it occurs when a baby is 1 to 4 months, and it involves sensation and new schemas. So during this, essentially, the baby will repeat pleasurable actions within its own body. So an example I'm going to kind of talk about is if a child maybe sucks his or her own thumb because they've done it previously, and they can do it again if they found it pleasurable. So when I was younger, my mom told me that I'd often suck my thumb right before I'd go to bed, which would make sense because oftentimes when babies do suck their thumb, they find comfort and kind of just overall a sense of calmness when they do so. So when she told me this, I wasn't surprised after learning this information. So other examples of primary circular reactions can be even a baby wiggling their toes or kicking. And so what's really, really important about this, it's that they're not reflex actions because the babies do commit to these actions intentionally.